Welcome to Turbulence, a special series on global finance and geoeconomics in an age of disruption. From All Things Policy, Takshashila's daily policy podcast. I'm Anupam Manur, Professor of Economics at the Takshashila Institution and Managing Editor of the Indian Public Policy Review. I'll be your companion through the series. Over the next 8 episodes, we are chasing a single question. Is the global order that has held since 1945 actually coming apart? Or is it being renegotiated into something new? We begin at the widest angle. The institutions built after the Second World War, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and the dollar at the center of it all, are under more strain than at any point in living memory. In this opening episode, we ask what is genuinely eroding, what's merely noise, and what the next world order might look like. To navigate all of that, I couldn't ask for a better guide. Narayan Ramachandran spent more than 3 decades on Wall Street, most of it at Morgan Stanley, where he ran the firm's India business and managed global emerging market portfolios worth tens of billions of dollars. Today, he's a co-founder and fellow of the Takshashila Institution and chairs or co-chairs a number of India's financial and social enterprise firms, among them TeamLease, Unitus Capital, and Vivriti. For 16 years, he's written Mint's fortnightly column, A Visible Hand, where, as you'll hear, many of the ideas in this conversation first appeared in print. Turbulence, Global Finance and Geoeconomics in an Age of Disruption, is a special series of Takshashila's All Things Policy podcast. This series is made possible by the generous support of Zerodha. In January this year, at Davos, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney told the room that the world we knew hadn't merely shifted, but that it had broken. The rules-based order the West built and lived by, he said, is fading, and it isn't coming back. And he invoked Thucydides to explain what was replacing that order. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. But Carney refused to accept that as fate. The middle powers, he insisted, are not powerless. For 80 years, that order was scaffolding upon which we built our economies. The institutions built from the wreckage of the Second World War, whether it is the IMF, the World Bank, the system that became the WTO, the dollar at the center of all of it, was supposed to be permanent. They were how the world order was stabilized. And now that scaffolding is showing cracks. Tariff walls are going back up. The financial plumbing turned into a weapon. Supply chains are torn apart and stitched back together along the lines of who trusts whom. So this is the question I want to sit with today. Is Carney right that this is a clean break, that the old order is simply gone and we must build a new one? Or are we in what my guest today has called a manthan, a churning of sorts, where the old certainties dissolve but something recognizable gets renegotiated on the other side? And if it is being rebuilt, who holds the pen? So to think through all of this, I'm joined by someone whose range across economics, markets, and geopolitics is about as wide as anyone I know. Narayan Ramachandran. Narayan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anupam. Delighted to be here.
Hey, so I want to start with a little bit of history. So even before we think about what is being broken, let's actually speak about what was there, what was built, and why did it hold for so long? Right. So the world order that we are comfortable with and the one that we are probably desperately trying to protect was built post-World War II in about 1944. This was when the Bretton Woods system came into being, and this is what is widely being recognized. So though the actual Bretton Woods system, which is the pure monetary exchange order that was there, got broken in 1971, the institutions that we built lived far, beyond its time. It outlived the actual gold exchange standard by about 50 years. Can you take us through all of this?
Sure. I think it is really helpful to think through the history, and at various points in this conversation, I'm sure we'll wade back into history all the way back to Thucydides or just all the way back 70, 80 years ago to the World War II, because it does set context, number one. Number two, it allows us some prediction power on where things might go, etc. So I do think the power of learning history is that, one, we can learn from it, and two, maybe we'll at least prevent ourselves from completely repeating it in the same fashion that we've been in it. So to start from World War II, as you said, I think it's important to remember that the Allies won the war, and the Allies won the war with the help of the Soviet Union. So even though subsequently there has been much movement, at that moment at the Yalta Conference, Soviet Union was as much represented in it as the US and UK and other allied powers. And so they constructed the world that they saw. And that world was essentially the world of slightly reshaped United Nations at that time. United Nations started earlier, but it got reshaped at that time. Bretton Woods was born, as you correctly pointed out. And then subsequently, all of the institutions of Bretton Woods were born in the years to follow. So you could say that there was a 40-year period, 40-ish year period. And I'm going to distinguish it from subsequent periods in the following way. That 40-year period ended up being truly a period of a Cold War between Russia and its allies, the so-called Comecon, and the rest. And believe it or not, China was in the rest. India and a few other countries were in the rest, but were one of few who could deal with both sides. So Egypt, India, and a few others, variably called non-aligned and so on. But really, you can think of themselves as either friends to everyone or friends to no one. Both were probably simultaneously true in that period. And so the world got carved into these two things. Now, some people use the word Cold War to describe today, and I think that would be quite inappropriate because that Cold War period from, let's say, the early 50s in particular to when the Berlin Wall fell in 89, there were actually two political blocs and two economic blocs. And there was nothing much that they did with one with the other. So pretty much they functioned on their own. And there was not that much interdependence.
Yeah.
And so the lesson from history I would draw to this one is that the world has become extremely interdependent. And the concept of a Cold War cannot exist in the fashion of 1950 to 1989. And therefore, I think it's an inappropriate phrase. We'll come up with other phrases. Anupam, you and I have spoken about impeded globalization as one such phrase. And I think we can describe it and talk about it in just a second. But it is certainly not a Cold War. So it may be you want to combine the economic aspect, impeded globalization, with a geopolitical aspect or a technology aspect, which is the algorithmic wars. And you put the two together. That's sort of the world we have moved to today. Very, very different from the world of 1950 to 1989. So we had this one 40-year period that was, or maybe 45-year period, that was essentially two blocks, two economic orbits, two interdependencies, two sets of interdependencies, and there wasn't much discussion. Now, it did serve to have some competition between the two, so that element of economics was valid. So, for instance, famously, Kennedy declared that by the end of this decade, we will put a man on the moon. And that was simply because Sputnik had already gotten a head start in their space of discovery. So while it was, even in that sense, a Cold War, elements of competition between the two blocs existed. That element of competition continues, but I think the Cold War metaphor is no longer valid. Then we went through, I think you can think of it as a 25-year period, sort of 1989 or 1990 to about 2014-15. This was a period of clear American hegemony, where America was the out-and-out superpower in the world. It relied on the institutions that were created, particularly in the 70s and 80s, everything from WTO and all of the other institutions that were created in the wake of Bretton Woods. It continued with the dollar as the reserve currency through that entire period, which and it is sort of early in that period that the term, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar came about, and so on. So they used a lot of the pillars of institutions and of exercising their influence and power around the world. But it was constructed as a King Arthur's court with a first among equals, and at least on the face of it. So you mentioned Carney right at the beginning of this conversation. I think Carney is being a little facetious because Canada was very much a part of that world. They were not the first among equals, but they were at the Five Eyes table of that first among equals, right? And so his story that Carney gave about the grocer in the old Czechoslovakia is completely inappropriate because Canada was very much part of the Anglo-Saxon ruling world from 1990 to 2014, and it would be wrong of him to project it any other way. So they benefited from that earlier system. Yeah. Just because the United States is not listening to them doesn't mean that they were not heavily benefited in the previous system. Sorry, you were saying something. Go ahead.
No, so I mean, you take it from 1989 till 2014. I slice and dice this slightly differently. Maybe, it might not really matter too much, but I go back just about 6 years. Maybe 6 years doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But I see a period between 1989 and 2008. And the financial crisis in, the Lehman Brothers crash, etc., in the US, for me, that seems to be the sort of structural break that changes the world order. I mean, that's when the rate of growth of trade starts falling down. Some of these institutions starts breaking up. That kind of led to the Eurozone crisis, the birth of, Donald Trump at one place and, right-wing extremism somewhere else, Brexit. So the 2008 financial crisis seems to be in my view, a slightly cleaner break. So is there any reason that you picked 2014 as the next kind of structural break?
Yeah, I don't want to give a false precision to this, Anupam. In history and in humanities, I would generally think about it as sunrise and sunset rather than a very clear, the rain started now, right? But what happens is that these cataclysmic big events have a role to play in the sun rising faster or the sun setting faster, right? In the same way that World War II itself played a role in the creation of many of these institutions. Of course, it was a sunrise because, as you yourself pointed out, Bretton Woods started right after the war. But by the time you got to actually WTO in its form that was very successful, it was nearly 20 years later. So everything happens with what I would call a fuzzy edge rather than a very precise edge. 2008 was a very important event. The reason I say it is a little bit later is that the politics that was brewing, so the two big events in this 25-year period, 2.5 events, let me call it, between 1990, so 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. So that was an event, it was a precise date, etc. But the American hegemony, which started in 89, sort of only really crystallized by 92, 93, 94. So it was, again, a very gentle thing. It didn't happen like overnight. Then there were two major events. One major event was, of course, the 2008 crisis. In between, there were some crises, but let's call them minor. Yeah, the Asian crisis, and then there was .com, etc. But the U.S. economy did well, barring some quarters through that entire period. But 2008 was a major crisis. Separately, WTO, China joined in 2002, I think it was, and really, again, the impact of China in the WTO system, you could probably date back to, 2004, 2005. So it took 2-3 years for China to really impress itself upon the world through the WTO system. But the political forces that then started through this extreme form of internationalization, if you will, or globalization, had started just about then. So if you think of the populist wave, the earliest populist in this is Erdogan, 2000, 2002. Putin, I think 2004, at least Putin won, etc. Right? So and then subsequently you had in Hungary, Orban in Hungary, etc. So you had a whole range, and then 2014. The reason I say 2.5 events is the half event was the taper tantrum in 2013, right? Which was a result of the 2008 crisis, but also the actions taken against the 2008 crisis that precipitated the taper tantrum in 2013. So economic events have a precision and a date surrounding them, but the politics and the response of politics to it is sort of a fuzzy before and after around these events. Now, you could say that you were brewing towards 2008 because of the extreme internationalization that started in 1990. That's one way to think about it. The other is you could say that the end of the internationalization started in 2008. Yeah, you can say it either way. But usually they go hand in hand. And I think that may be actually a good segue to the discussion about the future, that the big difference now, as it was well before World War II, is that both economics and politics matter again.
Yeah.
For at least 25 years, ended, I don't know, 5, 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, as you say, but let's say roughly in the 2010s, economics mattered more and logic, I'm going to put it within quotation marks, prevailed over politics. But in that period of internationalization, even though world incomes rose, so if you think of world as the box, it was benefited. But if you now take subsystems, the Midwest of America or the Manchester group in UK, they believed that they had lost out in this game. So the politics of reaction comes from that fact, at least in my view, that the factory worker in Ohio or Pennsylvania who had full healthcare insurance got $60 an hour and was able to educate his children in the state schools quite well. 20 years later is a gig worker with no health insurance addicted to fentanyl.
Yeah. So, but even this, I'm going to go back to the history question because I think it's important to see when did these things start changing. So, the order that we spoke about, the rules base, whether it's a trading order, the spread of globalization, the increasing rate of growth of trade across different kind of within the blocks, and then post 91 across, the end of the blocks as such. How did that order last so long? There were tensions that were coming up. Of course, there were dissidents of globalization. There were the losers from trade, but somehow that still carried on. It didn't really result in this kind of a political backlash, right? So, we know even in the 94 Uruguay round, you had people protesting against WTO. So there were all of those things. It's not that it was just a clean progress of the liberal ideas as such, but it still carried on rather smoothly. Maybe I'm again painting it with a very broad stroke, but you didn't have the kind of tensions that existed post 2014. So, what made that order last so long? What were the particular set of bargains at least the US had to make in their willingness to run it, whether it was providing the reserve asset supply, ensuring that there were open markets, the broad kind of even the security umbrella that goes with it. So I know these are maybe 2 or 3 related questions, but you can pick and choose.
Yeah, it's like everything, which is the straw that breaks the camel's back kind of question. I think it was building. So therefore, there were always elements of reaction. But to me, if I were to pick what broke the back of the world trade system, for instance, both in a positive and negative sense, was how well China did through the WTO. So, positively first, China seized the opportunity like no one believed they would. I mean, for instance, Chinese agricultural and meat exports 10x in 10 years. Chinese machinery exports 15, 20x in the same 10 years, right? So they seized that moment and ran with it like at least many people in the West did not expect them to. So that was one. So what was globalization and ended up being a very extreme form of globalization, even in the positive sense, where people were very happy to give up their comparative advantage in gazillion fields, everything from rare earths. I mean, only rare earths in the world in the 80s were made in the US. And a little bit in Europe, but mostly in the US. Yeah. And by 2000s, there were no rare earths being made in the US, right? So these kind of completely giving up manufacturing, giving up comparative advantage in many, many areas happened because, one, positively, the Chinese did extraordinarily well from 2002 to. That is another reason why I extended beyond 2008. It's not just a 5-year period. The WTO success of China can probably be at least 10 years, but I would say 12, 13 years starting 2002.
Right.
That's another reason why I come to mid-2010s, right? It also happens to be Putin's second term, Modi's first term, etc. There are many other reasons why 2014, 2015 sort of makes sense, and this is one of them. So one reason is a positive reason. The negative reason is China not only did it in the right way, they did it also in the wrong way, which is they dumped. And they, went overboard in terms of providing capital to all these industries. Those debts are stuck away in some closet somewhere in some state agencies, which we don't even know about. And therefore, at a very subsidized cost of capital, which then implies that there is no market-based return on capital, they were able to supply a lot of these things to the world, which then ended up, in a negative sense, killing industries all over the world. Right. So positively, they were good competitors. Negatively, they took drugs. So both were valid at the same time. And that was, to me, the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't that there was no reaction in the 70s or in the 80s. You could argue in the 70s, there was even an anarchist kind of movement around the world after the first oil shock and so on. So it was not that there was non-presence of antimatter throughout. But it is this China's both positive success and negative success that I think finally.
I have an interesting, thought. Just as you were saying, I'm obviously diverting from the overall episode goal, but could we say that even though, let's say, the terms of trade were sometimes against developing countries, or at least the perception of it was, let's leave even the objective reality to the side for the moment, the perception was that there were these rich developed countries who had terms of trade in favor of them and who were flooding markets. I'm doing all of this in quotes. And therefore, there were, protests against that form of globalization in the developing countries. But now the difference is that now the developed countries, which is the US and Europe, were feeling the tension of developing country, which is China, kind of flooding their markets and terms of trade being in a way unfavorable to them, that that they were not able to export. Was that a big difference, that who was being at the receiving end of globalization?
Yeah, I mean, that level of history is a little bit difficult for us to perfectly cast here, only because it's many, many years ago. And I think that there are two differences. One difference is that the previous regime, even before World War II, let's call it, even before World War I, actually, right, was that there was this, cotton from Newcastle and Birmingham coming to India, right? That broke the back of many cotton industries in India in the early part of the 20th century. But that was not a maybe it is borderline mercantilist, but it's not mercantilist in the same way that the East Asians practiced it. Right. There was not a flood of capital being provided. There was imperial power that allowed for protection and potentially also for certain legislations and mandatory purchasing and all of that. But it didn't actually flood capital into the system like the East Asians did. The East Asians have discovered a new method, which is now in a very different way, in a fiscal way, being discovered by the developed countries, which is that money can be a source of reverse imperialism.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And that's what, to some extent, Japan did, and then subsequently China did, which is just completely subsidize the export industry, even to the extent of poor returns on capital, and dominate, and then kill the competition. And in so doing, you dominate in years to come. Right? But there's a positive story there too. The positive story is they didn't sit on their laurels.
Yeah.
They actually built out the technology. They bought the technology. They improved on the technology. They adapted the technology. So it was not the ambassador car being sold forever.
Yeah.
It was, I mean, if you remember Hyundai, actually every one of these countries, my father used to tell me that in the 20s and 30s, the Japanese would have a woven basket on their back, and they would walk the streets of Chennai with their goods. And the people would say, don't buy those, they are very cheap. I mean, if you can believe it. That, as you know, became true of the Chinese 40 years later.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you and I remember when we used to call Chinese products cheap, and in many areas like toys, we still do.
Yeah.
Right? And that is, it was entirely true of Korean cars 25 years. So Hyundai was considered a basket case car manufacturer 25 years ago. And $15 billion of R&D later, they are in the top echelons of car producers. So again, they did flood the world. They did flood the world with cheap capital. That debt is still there somewhere in the system that they are not fully exposing, or somebody's paying the price. We can come back to who's paying the price in China, for instance. But the net positive is they have imperialized the world to their product, or monopolized the world to their product, the extreme case being rare earths for China.
Yes.
Simply, not only by doing this capital flooding and all that, but then by technology value addition. So the second part is, I think, a very positive thing that many, many countries, including the US, can learn from today. So anyway, back to the regime and history, if that's okay, unless you wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, I think we want to get to the meat of what's happening today, and of course we can always keep coming back to history and
no, but there's one period of history we haven't spoken about,
which is
the period from, you can call it 2008, but let's just say roughly early 2010s, 2012, 13, 14, to about Trump 2.
Yeah.
So to me, this was the pot ready to get stirred. Right. And all kinds of politics and economics happening in the middle of this period. First, as a consequence to the entire period from 1990 until then, but also as a consequence to the 2008 global financial crisis. So if you want to say the preview to the Manthan was happening in this period. And I think Trump 2, we are actually now in the Manthan right now as we speak. And the preview to the Manthan takes the shape in economics of China pushing back on. So tell me again why I can't have the head of the ADB, right? Tell me again why the IMF cannot be led by an Asian. These are all, by the way, unsaid rules. We talk about a rules-based order, but there are many unsaid rules in this rules-based order. And for instance, the IMF needs to be led by a European. The World Bank needs to be led by an American. ADB will be generally led by a Japanese, and so on. Right? So the club, like any club that we know, whether it is a country club or otherwise, always cushions its own pockets well, even though it might be very righteous. It's like the Madras Club. Even as it conducts its activities, it is very righteous about how it conducts its activities. Right? So that's exactly the way this club worked. And anybody who's outside this club, right, is saying, I'm outside this club. Tell me again why I don't deserve attention. India famously talking about it at the Security Council,
Yeah.
right? Banging on the door saying, listen, we're big boys now. Can we get a seat at the table? And then they offer all these crumbs, which is you and 40 others will be, or you and 40 others will be for 1 year at a time, etc. So that's the kind of, so this is exactly, you think about it as a neighborhood club, and this is exactly the way it works, right? And so China, India, and the big political thing was Russia started testing. So they walked into Crimea, which is another reason I choose 2014.
2014, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
They walked into Crimea. This was a pure test case. And the world did nothing much. Right now, you could argue that there was a reason why they should walk into Crimea. The 70% of the people in Crimea are Tatars. Tatars are closer to being Russians than they are Uzbeks, etc. There may be lots of historical logic for why that may or may not be the right thing to do, but it was a sovereign region that was part of Ukraine. And they walked in and nobody did anything. Obama spoke a few things and then that was it. We let it go. So that was, I think, the prelude to the test on Ukraine, actual Ukraine in 2022. So that was a political event. And many such small political tests and events took place around the world. And there was a populist and nationalist backlash, everything from Turkey to Philippines to Argentina, even Brazil. There was a lot of populist reaction saying, so the sentiment of anti-immigration and all that was coming in. So that was the prelude to this period we are in. I still think that the period we are in, and you should ask the questions now, is one of great churning.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but now I'm into this period. COVID played a big role as well. In some of the way that the economics shaped in terms of moving towards resilience. Of course, you had COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war in almost quick succession. That shaped the economic logic of what we are facing today, from moving away from a purely just in time to, just in case, about supply chain resilience. All of these became the buzzwords: friendshoring, nearshoring, whole bunch of things. We can come to that later, but I'm saying, and I deliberately want to come to that later, but COVID did also play a big role in all of this.
Yeah. And again, the economic history is also rhymes. So if you want to think about it, the depression of starting in 1929 and deeply intense in the early 30s, really, even though many things were tried, really only ended with the war.
Right.
So the true anti-deflationary device was the war that started in 1939. Not that it was necessarily started by the US, but it was responded to by the US after Hitler started it, right? But it was the only thing that actually drew the West out of depression. And even though we were not in depression, partly because of the famous Bernanke put after 2008, you would have thought that only an inflationary event would get you out of the extreme, what were they calling it? Slowflation, or all the words that were being used around the taper tantrum. And if you recall, interest rates were actually zero, and they were negative in many European countries.
In Europe, it was.
Yeah. So the world needed to find an event out of necessity to get out of that sort of semi-deflationary world that we were living in. Slow growth, low inflation, anemic probably is the right word, right? There was one good year in 2017, but other than that, it was quite anemic. And lo and behold, there was COVID. Now, the politics of the time is such that the two competing theories for how COVID happened are itself interesting in this context, right? One is that it was an accidental leak, but that the accidental leak, both the US and China had equal contribution. because the lab from where there might have been an accidental leak was actually not founded, but extremely well supported by the US and in particular Anthony Fauci. So as a individual villain in the US nationalistic scheme, Fauci is very high.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like, I mean, there is truth is definitely stranger than fiction here, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't make this up. You can't make up the fact. I mean, what I could argue the conspiracy theory and suggest to you there were many wild meat markets all over. There are many wild meat markets all over China. Why would it happen only in the wild meat market in which the biggest infectious diseases virology clinic was present? Right. So I don't know the answer to this question. The evidence was destroyed too early, so there can be no conclusion. It could have been a pure zoonotic transmission. It could have been anything else. But the whole idea that you can even think about all these things and think of them as being plausible is coming from this period of extreme distrust and period of extreme churn that has begun in this world. The trust is an essential coefficient in globalization.
Yeah, I'll come to that part. I want you to expand on that part. But let's come to now where we are, right? There've been obviously, there's been a lot of analysis of what is the current state? How do we characterize the current state? And there's words such as deglobalization, globalization, and so on. And you've kind of rejected those in favor for a new one, which I think you've coined, which is impeded globalization. And over the years that we've been talking, you've successfully persuaded me that that is the way. But can you kind of just describe this? Is it just semantics, or how do you characterize this idea of impeded globalization?
No, at one level, it is only semantics of words. And as Noel Hariri says, words are now going to be taken over by AI, so it doesn't matter anymore. But at another level, it's not, because for us to truly comprehend the world and therefore adjust our policy and our action to it requires us to diagnose where we are relatively carefully. And to me, we are not in the Soviet bloc, Western bloc world that we were in after World War II. We are in an interconnected world. So that's the first observation. We are in an interconnected world. In that interconnected world, US and China are near peers, right? US wants to get out of this situation and go back to the previous world, not necessarily with a rules-based order, but where it was the clear first among equals. And you can understand a lot of Trump's actions as essentially that. He's not crazy or irrational or anything. He wants to project power far from home base in such a manner that it becomes clear that only the US can do that. Right? No, and so you could understand the Iran war as a projection of power more than it is anything else. It might have been silly to go and attack a country with 3,000 years of civilization so far away, etc., etc. But from the point of view of reminding China that, hey, listen, we can interfere in Iran and nobody else can, I think it serves a purpose. And then China thinks twice about that, right? So US is trying to grab things back to an older state of its own first among equal status by saying, I'm powerful. And in fact, you could understand even the trade war in the same context, right? I told you that zero trade was good and you did it. Zero cost of trade.
Yeah.
And now I'm telling you that a 10% cost of trade is good and you will do it.
Yeah.
Right. And so reductio absurdum, that's power. I mean, The economists will argue is 12 better than 10 or 9 or 3. But either you have no friction or you have some friction. Right. Anyway, so I think this is what's happening from the US point of view. But from the Chinese point of view, they think that US is an aristocratic power And if I can give a little nudge to Humpty Dumpty, it'll come crashing down.
Oh.
Right. So this is what what China is doing, sapping US resources. So China is trying a long game of sapping US resources and money. And understood from this point, just this lens, and I'm not a conspirationist and none of those, but understood from this lens, you could think of why an accidental COVID thing is not far-fetched.
Right.
Because it could be in China's good interest for US to expend extraordinary fiscal resources on combating COVID. That's a method of using up US energy in a different direction than military or reasserting their power around the world.
But at huge cost to themselves as well, right? Chinese economy suffered quite a bit.
It did, but it's a relative game.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's a very high stakes relative game. I'm not pushing this theory, so don't get me wrong. All I'm saying is there is this world in which there are two near rivals, right? And these near rivals want a state. China wants a new state. And ideally, from its point of view, it wants a G2, and not in a full cooperation sense, but a G2 where the rules are pre-negotiated with the US. But it does want that. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah.
That it does want that. Unlike the Soviet Union, which only did that for nuclear stockpile reduction, didn't do it for anything else. The Soviet Union had no interest in anything else with respect to the US in direct conversation. Whereas the China will do this on again, off again. I think this will characterize the next phase for sure. That there will be this interdependence, and this interdependence will be continuous give and take. Occasionally, US will try a heave-ho shove from the shoulder. And similarly, for example, with what they did with rare earths, China will try a similar thing. No, it's like two pehelvans. There's no sharp instrument in this kushti, but two pehelvans are jostling for power. And occasionally one does the heave-ho to the other. And I think you will see this continually going forward. Now, if this gets entrenched, and this is the only thing that happens, then the ants in the wrestling pond, so to speak, will get squished. And that includes small countries, but it's not very good for India either. Right? Yeah. Because essentially they are breaking up the world into an interdependent world and an independent world. And in the interdependent world, they get the spoils, both of them, or they get substantially the spoils. And in the independent world, we have to make a choice about which independent world we join.
Correct.
And that requires us to forsake our autonomy. And from India's point of view, if it comes to that second thing, we will have no choice. We will have to go with US.
US, yeah. That's kind of pre-decided almost. So give us a quick lesson in electrical engineering. What do you mean by impedance? That could be very brief, but then go on to say, how do we apply that? So give us the texture of this, right? So what is still flowing freely? What's plateauing? What's being actively restricted? So, we don't need to get into specific good, but what are the category of goods and services that would follow this? So
the word impedance, and I chose this carefully from engineering, as you correctly point out, Anupam, and the engineers will appreciate this, is a little bit more than resistance. Resistance, everybody understands, is both an English word and a science word or a physics word. And it simply means resistance is the friction to the flow of electricity, for instance, in a circuit. Impedance has this additional combination of reactance. And the word reactance is actually a very interesting word. I'm surprised it's not enough used in corporate parlance. But reactance is an additional source of resistance that comes from frequency fluctuation. And what that by definition means is, one is it's an additional source. It's a different, somewhat unpredictable source. And second, that it is actually unpredictable and variable based on the frequencies.
Right.
So sometimes you push, they'll push back. Sometimes you push, they won't push back, right? So it's definitely not a linear kind of understanding. Resistance is linear. Well, actually, to be super precise, resistance is not linear, it's quadratic, but you get the idea. In English, resistance is linear. In the word impedance, therefore impeded globalization, means that you have two forms of resistance. One, regular resistance, and the second is a resistance caused that is somewhat variable and unpredictable, sometimes to your action and sometimes by their initiation. So it could be both proactive and reactive, right? So it's what in finance George Soros called a reflexive system. Right. Unlike other systems, what you do affects the behavior of the other party. And it becomes even more complex because in a world there are multiple parties. So you could potentially have China and US having in between some actions going on, but then you have other parties now that are then represented by what in diplomatic speak we are now calling plurilaterals and other groupings, BRICS and Quad and G7 and so on. Each of them reacts a little differently to the same push and pull. So this complex phenomenon is what I call impeded globalization. And I have sort of thought through it, and at least my proposition would be that whatever we get to post this Manthan, we will remain in a world of impeded globalization for the foreseeable decade or decade and a half, right?
So I'm going to just clarify that just a bit. So here we are saying that there will be certain, let's say, goods and services that will still flow freely, right? Where the resistance as such is very little. There are certain things which there will be active kind of resistance, right, from the players. So, where there is, it's not flowing as freely and so on.
And variable,
yeah. So sometimes it is it and sometimes it isn't.
Yeah. And it is to some things even in that category and not to other things within. And do that, you can look at the NVIDIA example and say for some time everything was banned, then virtually nothing was banned, then all except Blackwells are banned, now all except Vera is banned. So it's this variability and jostling for which will be first. And here the private sector player can also become variable.
Yeah. And as we're seeing with things that are happening with Anthropic, for example, you're seeing that.
So Anthropic and NVIDIA are the two current examples.
Yeah.
And the behavior of the private sector is not perfectly predictable, that they will always want the biggest market and so on.
Right.
So it is this very interesting world. So that's one area. But a lot of the low value added goods and services. So I would broadly make a 2x2 matrix. Services and goods, low value added, high value added.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Generally speaking, high value added, both goods and services, is where this will play out. And by and large, your toothbrush made in China is coming through without a problem.
Yeah.
And similarly, lots of consumer goods and shoes and so on. So even though famously there was this debate about, why should tariffs apply to things like shoes and so on. So the unilateral country-based tariff actually made no sense because of this. Because you need to think about the world in this sort of complex way. And it was just too complicated for the politicians to think about it. So they just did it unilaterally and without nuance. But really what is now settling in is that low value goods and services are flowing quite freely in all directions. And there is certainly not a ban. I mean, you see how much political angst there is about discussion of Israel and Gaza in the US. But I mean, every day there are conversations on China in the US campus. People are not being banned for that. They're being banned if you're pro-Israel or pro-Gaza.
Right.
But there's nothing against China that is being, in that sense, spoken about in the US. Of course, there are certain, technology space and others that are not easily shared. In America has created this, actually, again, it predates even Trump too. It goes back again to, I think it could well be 2014, this thing called CFIUS, And CFIUS is essentially a framework, a legal framework, a legislative framework, where anything that is in competition between China and the US needs to be subject to the CFIUS test. And then if it is on the other side, then it goes through an approval process. So it, again, predates this, but it's sort of culminating now. So I think this idea of a 2x2 framework where the low valued goods and services will flow in an interdependent fashion. There were no shoes going between the Soviet Union and America.
Yeah.
45. So that is a fundamental difference, right? And then the variability in the value added services. New administration comes in, sort of the view from the top in China changes for whatever reason. Then you have a variability, the what is in and what is out goes, it changes, right? So I think this is the world that we're going to live in. It in that sense, it has changed. But I think Carney is concluding too early that all elements of the past are gone.
Yeah. But there are certain parts, again, which I think something that you've paid attention to, which might not take the headlines every time, which is about the loss of trust in the institutions, right? So the impedance of trust networks. And I think that you're saying that will outlive all of these variabilities for particular goods, right? So you could have, whether it's the universities, the big science collaborations, genomic and whatever collider collaborations, etc. These are splintering into trust blocks, right? And this is what I think you've written as well. And so this will have a much greater, longer term impact on the way that the world is shaped.
Yeah. So there will be two space stations.
Yeah.
They already are two colliders, and there will be probably, as the generations of colliders goes on, there will be two colliders. So far, there is only one lithographic machine or provider, right? Now, will that be two? And will China be able to get to that point? We'll have to see, right? Can China make jet engines at the same caliber as the West yet? Unknown. So there is a technology issue as well. But assuming the physics is not a problem, see, generally speaking, given enough time, science will diffuse. And we are in a world in which there is sufficient interdependence, even in the world of Ramanujam, and then before that in the world of Leibniz, and in the world of the ancient Greeks and Indians and Arabic scholars, there was technology diffusion. So in our world, there will be technology diffusion, even if, whether it is through actually the fact that the three postdocs in America are all Chinese, which has been the case for the last 30 years, or that through published papers and through discovery in both ends, eventually the world is one, there will be technology diffusion. The question is actually what of adaptations of technology and how far each trust block pushes itself. So for instance, TSM doing what it does, which block does it belong to? The 2 nanometer manufacturing capability belongs to which block, right? That will become an interesting thing. The science of 2 nanometer technology is reasonably well known.
Yeah.
It is the manufacturing in the 2 nanometer semiconductor wafer that becomes the bottleneck. Same with rare earths and so on. So trust is going to play a big role in this evolution. And my sense is that it's not going back to the old world of trust anymore. And this is not only true in technology, it's also true in finance. And then to me, one major Lakshman Rekha, to use an Indian term, or line that was crossed, red line that was crossed, was when two things happened after the Ukraine war. One was reserves were frozen. And two, the SWIFT messaging system was declared a Western idea, and therefore subject to Western control, right? Both have scared the living daylights out of the rest of the people.
Yeah.
Right. So in a way, the West has hurt itself a lot by doing these two things. They should never have done it. But it just basically means that, see, what they had done was they had created a system where you could appeal some of these transgressions. Generally speaking, they were benevolent enough not to do the transgressions, at least in a very overt way. Not that there were not bad things happening in the world, but at least they were not of a scale and of a egregiousness that has now manifested itself. So trust is another. So this is another, I think, thread that we can draw into the future. That technologically speaking, we will have to create decentralized systems like tokens, not AI tokens, but blockchain tokens, in order to understand ledgers and so on, in order to create trust in a decentralized way.
Yeah.
In a same way you have to do it politically, which is it's in smaller groups, it's on a particular issue. I don't think you get that belief in the positive world and in a world generally heading in the right direction that we had for 30, 40, 50 years after World War II.
Right. I want to now go on to kind of a small side quest, which is on the idea of the weaponization of trade and economics, which has also been happening. And in one of your articles, I think you've written that basically China's rare earth strategy, or that trump card, is not permanent, and that separately, that the coercive leverage essentially loses its potency once it's used, right? So is weaponization actually self-limiting? It has a particular cutoff period beyond which it just loses its potency. Or how do we actually look through this, right? On one hand, I'm seeing that, Russian sanctions are still going on. Dollar weaponization hasn't actually reversed, but it is perhaps losing its potency. As I said, it's punishing Russia, but not necessarily making Russia backtrack. How would you look at this idea of increased weaponization of economics?
So first, one step, even before we get to economics, again, politics. And now I think all of us in the economics domain have to accept that politics is more important than economics. It's not that economics is unimportant, but that politics is more important. So any argument in economics will, for policy or for anything else, will need to be made with sound economic logic, but with political economy ability to persuade. Otherwise, it's not going anywhere. So in that context, the politics of this weaponization is that democracies have lost their ability to take pain, serious pain, right? Hence the flooding after COVID with the fiscal dollars. Hence the Bernanke put after 2008. In fact, famously, the Greenspan put after 2002, etc. Right. So the democratic systems are now cushioned. To rephrase Stalin's famous phrase, I mean, Stalin said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. In democracies, they can deal, and I'm being very macabre about it, people can deal with 10, 20, 30 kind of fatalities. But the moment it becomes in the hundreds, it's an issue. And that is both misery in terms of economics, inflation, depression, deflation, or health, fatality, injury. And so this is a vulnerability. In some senses, it's a vulnerability, right? Because if you can't take that pain, then you must always cushion the pain somehow. And that cushioning the pain comes from resources somewhere. And so using economics as a method of conflict and a method as a technology in conflict and as a method in warfare is one way. It's the exact, what I would call the financial analog of using drones. Somehow it looks like you're playing a video game. And it reduces the feeling and the impact that you might have. I mean, the average American has no idea that Swift resources were, Swift messaging system was taken out of all the banks in Russia. Nor does he know what that means, et cetera, right, to what his life is. So that's what I mean. so the weapons of economics are itself an instrument that limit the pain to democracies. And so you will, again, this is another thread that I would pull through in the forward, that I don't see any reason why democracies are going to get more resilient and more able to take pain. And therefore, they will cushion their fall. And cushioning their fall means they will react not only with military. I mean, the best answer is obviously don't enter conflicts. But if you must enter conflicts, as unfortunately several politicians decide that they must, then they try multiple things rather than. So as even in the India-Pakistan context, we have now used water as a economic warfare weapon, simply because it's one easier step than flying Rafales across the border, right? From a purely democracy point of view, it's just much easier to defend and explain than doing outright military warfare or much more intense combat or putting boots on the ground, as is the phrase nowadays. So that's one way, one lens on weaponization. The second lens on weaponization is if it is done very sharply, it does cause pain. The system doesn't get time to adjust. So rare earths, a classic example, the trial balloon came in, I think, 2018. And then the real action took place in last year.
Yeah.
And given how quickly it came and how ill-prepared everybody was, it was a wake-up call. Suddenly to America and the US had to respond in a manner in which it tempered a lot of things on China. And the very fact that they're continuing to talk, etc., is still that weapon is a serious weapon for the time being. Right. By the way, the economic, you mentioned Russia, but the economic warfare against Iran has had significant impact on Iran, the sanctions.
But I was about to ask, so of course it'll have impact, but I think, was that a deliberate distinction that you were drawing in terms of democracy's ability to withstand or tolerate pain is going down? But does that mean then Russia and China, for instance, if you ever get to a stage where, let's say, the West is imposing some form of sanctions on China as well, would its ability to tolerate pain is necessarily much higher than democracies? I mean, by its very structure, we know it to be. It's not been tested, though. Any preliminary thoughts on that?
Yeah, I generally think that the ability of non-democracies to take pain will be higher because they don't have to answer to the population. Eventually, they do. I mean, if you read long history, you will see that even dictatorships ultimately answer to the public, right? And the more extreme the dictatorship, the shorter the duration. But, I mean, in North Korea, we've had it go for a long time. I mean, in the scheme of history, it may not be a very long time, but let's say it's 90 years or 100 years right now, or 80 years. It's a very long time. They're taking all manner of pain against these sanctions. They're not reverse imposing any sanctions. They can't. Really, they don't have that much to deal with. But they're taking the pain and just living with it, right? So, of course, the second lens on economic weaponization is if it's sharp and you do have a credible monopoly on the resource, then it can work at least in a short period of time, right? So rare earths being an example, Indus Water Treaty in India's context being an example. It's there can be many examples of economic weapons. You control it. You have to be in control. It can't be a leaky sieve, right? So if you control it, then it could have serious impact. So it's just an additional tool, I would say, rather than the tool or the final tool. Economics says even with the power that the US has and the multiple attempts it is making in military and economic terms in Russia, in the Gulf, we're not closer to a conclusion because of that, right? So sometimes they go hand in hand. For instance, the naval blockade of the US goes hand in hand with an economic freezing. And then together that squeezes the... By the way, economics can work in the other way. You outspend the other guy.
Right.
To some extent, you could argue that was the end of the Soviet Union. It was not economic blockade in the classical sense. It was you just spend them into the ground. So they try to match you and compete. And in trying to match you and competing. So that's what actually China is trying against the US, which is let them spend frivolously. And as they spend frivolously, they'll become weaker and weaker.
Right. But yeah, this is probably a good segue into thinking about, again, back to, the order that was and the order that isn't. For the longest time, you had sanctions. The US would still impose sanctions on countries, and I think that was understood. And of course, there are conditions under which the sanctions work. Even the United States, I think I had read some evidence that post 1970s, only 1 in 5 sanctions were successful. Now, of course, it goes back to how do you define the success and so on, but we leave that aside for the time being. Now, of course, the range of instruments used are much larger. Even tariffs, of course, now Trump is using tariffs as his primary weapon of choice in the economic realm. As far as the global institutions had any say, whether it is the WTO or others, there was some kind of element of restraint that was put upon people, right? At least you had the background threat that there's an WTO appellate body that you were answerable to. And now I don't think that exists anymore. You don't even have judges in these appellate bodies, right? So it's become sort of irrelevant. So that's just the background. I want to talk to you about where are we going now with the global institutions? Are they completely irrelevant, or do you see a way in which some of it still maintain some form of relevance? Maybe the UN Security Council, maybe the IMF, but not necessarily other parts. I think the WHO and so on are already going, are on its way to becoming sort of irrelevant because of just the lack of funding. So what is the framework that you would use to understand or to think through the future of these global institutions?
Yeah. So as you say, almost all of them are dysfunctional. WTO is an example. The WTO appellate body is an example of a part of an institution that's actually dead and has been dead for quite some time. And contrary to popular opinion that it was done by Russia or China, it's actually done by the US, right? Or at least precipitated by the US for that particular thing. So the seeds of the death of these institutions again started some 10, 15 years ago after the global financial crisis, which then got into the political movement that Trump is poster child for, which is, why do we need all these things? They don't really help us. We are clearly the best in the world. We should say we are the best in the world and the strongest in the world, and we should exert that power everywhere. Honestly, I have to say I don't know the answer to this question, but I would think along 2 or 3 dimensions. One dimension is we tend to project the near term quite sharply. And I would just say, let's take 3 individuals who are well past their 70s, and one of them is now 80, and they are the head of US, China, and Russia. And just imagine in a world in which 2 of those 3 don't exist, right? As is the inevitable logic of humankind. You could have something very different. We don't know what it is, but it could be very different. So it's very difficult. You can only think in scenarios. You can't really think too much in predictable models about where things will head. The second way to think about it is, what are these threads and how these threads that we spoke about earlier, how will they get pulled into the future? So I do think this thread of interdependence but lack of trust, in economic terms called impeded globalization, in geopolitics you might call it as low trust geopolitics, multilateralism or low trust multilateralism. Both will be valid for quite some time. And so we will get what I would call minimal institutions. Now, whether those minimal institutions are the imploded form of current institutions or they are new institutions, time will tell.
So I want to ask you that. Is it just minimal institutions or is it competing institutions? So, for example, China has been building its own set of kind of rival institutions, right? You have the AIIB, they've tried with the BRICS New Development Bank, of course, the entire BRI, the Belt and Road Lending, etc. Are these genuine rivals? In some cases, if you just look at the data now, lending through the renminbi has, I think, for the first time, exceeded that of lending via dollars. And I mean, that has different rates because the interest rate in China was slightly lower and so on. But also, I think before Trump, when you take money from China, it comes with its own set of course, terms and conditions, some of it against national interests, of course, of those countries. But crucially, it didn't come with the lectures around morality that the United States would do. So there's no interference in purely political power struggles of the person in power in these developing countries, right? So there's no things about human rights and so on when China gives you money, right? So maybe some countries genuinely prefer to take money from China instead of the global institutions, which comes with that austerity measures about even political conditions, etc. Right? So do you see these as genuine rivals going forward with two sets of institutions existing side by side?
See, the reason why I think we are in a period of churn is already some of these alternatives are discrediting themselves. Right? So it's not that they are answers to the problems created by the previous regime. They are answers and they have also failed answers. So, for instance, you could argue that this is again a fertile ground for communism to come back. But communism is not coming part because it failed the world to do what it was supposed to do, right? So now you have populism, and populism of the type that we are speaking about, and it is failing around the world. Orban has been kicked out of Hungary. The thing has turned over in Brazil and Argentina and other places, and so on, right? So, and I think you could say at the end of Trump's term, we will also have a reckoning on whether Trump has partially succeeded or not at all. And so you're getting sort of evidence of this because it's now marinated for 10 years or so, if not longer. And people are disgruntled with this too, right? So it's not that this is the answer and therefore we will go down this direction into creating institutions that suit this direction. That is my take. Same with the Chinese model. While you may not like what the IMF did or the World Bank did or any of the post-Bretton Woods institutions of that previous regime did, they did a lot for the world in terms of global prosperity. That evidence is available. Right? The mid-America auto engineer can be unhappy.
Yeah.
But the median worker in China or India cannot be unhappy from that world because their incomes went up and so on. Right? The peak of this, the best period in India's independent economic history is 2003 to 2008.
Yeah, that's the period where we had 3 years of 9+% growth and so on. Of course, helped by liquidity. Yeah.
Doesn't matter. But it was the peak of that regime as well. And it was India positive, non-zero revenue deficit, non-negative revenue deficit, rupee appreciating.
1 year of current account surplus.
On all counts, that was the best period. But it was not true for India alone. It was true for Brazil. It was true for China. So it was true for a whole bunch of emerging markets that were being lifted by that boat that started in 1990, or the tide that started in 1990. Right? So there are beneficiaries, and there are people who... I think the mistake that the West made is it did not make enough of an assessment of those who would be hurt and have programs to mitigate that hurt. So in particular, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, which is where a lot of the churning in American politics takes place.
Right.
Because that's the so-called purple states. And in the purple states, you have a lot of debate as to what is going on and how should I influence my future. But because this 10-year phenomenon or 15-year phenomenon has also started failing, I don't know that this is the anchor upon which the future will rest. There are some threads that will continue, but I don't think, which is why I think we are still in a period of great churn. I think we will rediscover some of these institutions in a simplified, maybe you'll like this term, new one, for you. Ozempic multilateral institutions. Right? So they have been trimmed down from their flat that they had acquired over the bureaucratic years. And they will do minimally some things. Why is India still interested in the Security Council? If it is obsolete, then we should leave it to be obsolete and create new institutions in which we have a seat at the table. But I think, for instance, that version of the Security Council will find, that part of the United Nations will find a new avatar. What exactly that avatar is, etc., we'll see. But it will survive. Now, will the ILO and the FAO survive? Yeah, very difficult to say. And should they? Sorry, so there are two questions: should they survive, and will they survive? I don't know. I would just say that we will have much more built for purpose, slimmer Ozempic institutions than the fat, all pervasive institutions that we had.
In some way, the IMF drastically reinvented its purpose, mandate, and raison d'etre in 1971. Until then, its entire purpose was to establish a fixed exchange rate regime and make sure that people followed it. And with the closing of the gold window by Nixon in 71, it had to reinvent itself to say we'll be the lender of last resort for balance of payments crisis, right? So maybe some institutions will refine the purpose, maybe some will die out. We have to see how that goes on. Well, let's move to India. And since we're just about running out of time, let's do this as a rapid fire round. Just quick thoughts on how do you see India kind of navigating through all of this? My first question on that is, do you think we have the luxury and economic heft to do some form of issue-based alignment? Or do we even have a say on these things? Where do you see kind of India navigating through all of this in this era of impeded globalization?
No, so India is important. Sometimes the Mandarins in Delhi think we are all important. That is not true. But we are important because we have a customer base of 1 billion people and a large still growing middle class with increasing real wealth. So for all of those reasons, I think India is important. And I think to the extent possible, we should continue our swing power or strategic autonomy ways that we have been conducting business now for quite some time, which allows us to deal with Iran and Russia on oil, with China on agriculture, with the US and France on defense equipment, etc. So it suits our national interest. But we should not be under any illusion that the WTO world, which benefited China, would have benefited India. Yeah. We are choosing this second world only because we have no choice. And therefore, to us, the more we can go back to those institutions and that kind of framework, the better it is for us. The more multilateral the world is.
But internally, it's difficult, though. If you take the time that when we had to do the big reforms, whether it is in trade and labor and all of that, we didn't. We kind of, have we missed the bus? Is it a little, we still have to do many of those things now, but there is an added layer of pressure to do protectionism, because it's like on a game theoretical model when every other country in the world is doing industrial policy plus protectionism. Do we even have the courage to go out and argue for unilateral reduction in trade barriers from India's side?
I think we do. And I think we must, because it does benefit India. The more and again, the frame is one of impeded globalization. It's not a fortress world. If it's a fortress world, we have to get used to being poor. But if we're not in a fortress world, we're in an impeded globalized world, in at least in my take on the world. And therefore, we accept that as reality and we say, hey, listen, wherever we can, we trade. And if we need to be unilaterally low friction from our side, let's do that. What are we gaining by adding frictions from our side? For us, the rising tide lifts our boats. It doesn't matter whether they lift other boats or not. So just because we want to shrink the tide, they are shrinking the tide, so we should shrink the tide, so all boats get stuck in the sand. That's not a good
Or the Joan Robinson metaphor, right? Just because it's difficult to put ship goods to their ports, we put rocks on our own port so that yeah, that doesn't work.
It doesn't work. So we should be the voice for multilateralism, engagement, peace, trade, low friction, right? And now, in certain domains, semiconductors, certain strategic areas, we may not have that luxury in full. But everywhere else, we should be the ones thumping the table. I mean, I don't see why India, to use a maybe not a great metaphor, but India should be the poster child in Davos today.
Yeah.
Why are we ceding that alternatively to Trump and to Xi? Yeah, I mean, that's just a metaphor. I don't literally mean it in Davos, but there's no reason why we shouldn't be that flag bearer of multilateralism. Rather than celebrating some historical greatness or that. Now, the good news for India is we still have a tailwind in terms of demographics and in terms of productivity and all of that. And I think that carries us a few years. But two things happen after those few years, and I don't know what few years is, but 5 to 7 maybe. One is India is not at all prepared for an innovation economy.
Oh, yeah.
And that then means that we will hit the wall as a middle income country. And hitting the wall as a middle income country is a dangerous thing. You'd rather not even become a middle income country because you just hit that and then you recoil. As you can see that in Mexico, just severe crime, all kinds of issues that come out as a result.
Yeah.
Brazil,
Argentina,
Thailand, many countries have hit this wall, and Malaysia, and gone nowhere. Gone nowhere is probably what I would call a Malaysia. Gone badly is like Mexico, where retrogressed because of crime and other things. So we have to be very careful about this, and we have to build the institutions of innovation, which is in our capacity now, in order to deliver 10 years from now. I think this is one of my biggest things that I'm trying to persuade people is India should prepare itself for tomorrow's knowledge economy. Now, we have an additional challenge to everything we have spoken about so far, which is we still don't know what the impact of AI on labor markets is going to be. And unfortunately for India, it comes at a bad time. So India has had two bad breaks, which China did not have. China had WTO for 15 years at a time in which employment could grow on even low productivity activities. Both of those are taken away from us.
Yeah.
So we have a major challenge to get over those. We have a cushion of 5 years, which is on pure momentum of demographics and low productivity going to higher productivity. But productivity going to knowledge and innovation productivity, we are not at all prepared for.
Yeah. And that, I mean, there's the kind of reforms that were required in education, skills, and so on that we had to do, I would say in 1991 or even earlier, but at least when we kind of reformed some of this and the labor market reforms, that has still not come through in the way that we'd want. Yes, there's some consolidation in the labor codes, etc., but it's not enough, not for the scale of challenges ahead of us. We'll quick again, last bit, and I want to ask you this, right? I think your 2026 call was, in some sense, of fracturing America and a rising Europe. Can you spell that out? Is it really the end of US exceptionalism? Is Europe reawakening?
Yeah, I think the second question is easier to answer. Europe is reawakening. I have no doubt about it. You can talk about it as defense spending in Germany or Mark Carney's speech from Canada, but every European head of state probably wished they had given that speech, right? So I think Europe is awakening. There are also centers of innovations like Sweden that are now coming. Very small country, but it's actually a reasonable economic success story, and it's not a welfare state. Public debt to GDP in Sweden is 40%. It's 106% in the US. Right? So a so-called welfare state with 40% debt to GDP against a non-welfare capitalist state with 106% debt to GDP. So I think the eyes have become open. It may still be slow, but Europe's eyes are open. America is a more complicated phenomenon, but I think, and particularly difficult to talk about whether end of American exceptionalism in the week in which SpaceX was listed at a $2 trillion valuation. And the only two real competitors are also going to be from the US, right? So, technology wise, I don't think the American exceptionalism is over. However, I don't think they understand what they've done. They are doing to themselves with this, not just illegal immigration, but legal immigration also being tackled. So the number of postdocs, the number of Chinese, Indians, Koreans that are there in all of these labs dropping sharply. And then once that happens, the brightest in America don't necessarily go to becoming even professors, stay on as professors. So it's the beginning of a negative cycle. I just hope it doesn't go all the way, but it's the beginning of a negative cycle because the raw material for innovation is postdocs. And they're striking at the root of that by killing legal immigration from all of the Asian countries, which is what made all of this last 40, 50 years of innovation possible. Everything, I mean, all this, everything, SpaceX, I mean, famously, Elon Musk is from outside America, right? I would say to you that, and again, in that same article, column I wrote, Anupam, that I think Trump has peaked. And my expectation is that there will be gridlock in the US starting with the midterm. And for the first time, gridlock may actually be useful because it will precipitate a discussion about what should be the future of America. And in that discussion, America's churn is always faster, which is a good thing. So their churn may take far fewer years than ours or any Asian countries. And they will come up with something that looks different from the last 7 or 8 years. We had Trump, then we had anti-Trump, and then now we have Trump 2, which is totally different from Trump 1 or Trump 2.5, right? But till the midterm. My sense is after 2.5, it's gridlocked. And if Congress divides in its political loyalties, then there will be at least 1 or 2 impeachment rounds. It won't succeed because they won't have enough votes in Senate, but it will. There will be impeachment. So basically, gridlock, right? So each side will be charging the other with something, and nothing much will happen. And already you can see, even the Supreme Court, even though there are some very obvious victories that Trump has had, there are also many that have not worked out this year. So if you go legally, institutionally, tariffs, etc., one by one, this year is a far more mixed year than last year.
Yeah, definitely.
And as the year goes on, it's getting even more mixed by the day, right? And my sense is it will turn negative in terms of balance. And therefore, Trump, the individual, has peaked. Elements of Trumpism will continue. And the question is, what will they continue and coexist with in the rest of the country? And that's what we'll have to. I mean, you've heard this fellow Ezra Klein speak about supply side abundance from the Democratic side. You've seen a lot of the populist left people like AOC and Zoran Mamdani and others. So there is a churn going on in American politics about what should be our future. Because they know that many people know that the old future, the 19 to 2014, is not their future. But they also know that the new future, which is represented by Trump 2017 to today, is not their future either. So then the question is, what is it? Right? So that's the discussion I think they're all having. And will become front and center in a few months in the midterms and then again in the presidential election. Very difficult to call which way this will go.
This is a good place to end the episode because we end on uncertainty. The world is uncertain. We don't know. But thank you for highlighting some of the threads that we have to look out for, in which, the threads that will pull the world in these different directions. And I think that's the best form of predictability that we can have at the moment to look at what are the levers, what are the threads that would pull the world at. So I thank you extremely, Narayan, for this. I think this gives a brilliant overview of all of these different measures. We will look into some of these things as in the different episodes that will come up. Thank you. Thank you so much, Narayan.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed that conversation. If you're interested in public policy, AI, geopolitics, or defense, do check out the courses offered by the Takshila Institution. And for more conversations like this one, stay tuned for the next episode of Turbulence, Global Finance and Geoeconomics in an Age of Disruption, a special series of the All Things Policy podcast supported by Zerodha.